After spending 40 years building my real estate business from nothing, I never imagined my own granddaughter Lynette would exclude me from her wedding. I'd helped raise her after my daughter Victoria's divorce, but once Lynette met her fiancé's wealthy family, I became an embarrassment. What she didn't know was that the prestigious Rosewood Estate where she desperately wanted to be married had been my most treasured acquisition 5 years earlier, a secret I'd kept even from my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I still remember the day the invitation arrived for every member of our family, except me. That same afternoon, I received a call from Tobias, Lynette's fiancé, inquiring about a last-minute booking at Rosewood Estate. They had no idea they were speaking to the grandmother who apparently wasn't good enough to witness their vows. For 3 decades, I had poured everything into building a life for my family, sacrificing my own comforts to ensure my children and grandchildren would never know the poverty I had experienced. My story begins in the small town of Millfield, where I was born to parents who worked the land but never owned it. My father died when I was 16, leaving my mother and me with nothing but debts and dreams. I married young to Augustine, a kind man with ambition but little business sense. When he lost our savings in a failed venture, I took matters into my own hands. While raising Victoria and her brother Philip, I started buying small, neglected properties, renovating them myself on weekends, and selling them for modest profits. Augustine thought I was foolish at first, questioning why I would spend our grocery money on a dilapidated cottage when we barely had enough to feed ourselves. Because one day that cottage will feed us for years, I told him. And I was right. Property by property, I built a small empire while working as a receptionist at the local doctor's office. The townsfolk knew me as the quiet woman who answered phones and scheduled appointments. Few realized I owned half the rental properties in the east end of town. Victoria never understood my drive. "Why do you keep buying these old buildings, Mother? Why not enjoy life a little?" she would ask. I never told her that each property was insurance against the kind of desperation I had known in my youth. Each deed was a promise that my children and grandchildren would always have options I never had. When Victoria's marriage to Gerard fell apart, I was there to help raise Lynette while Victoria rebuilt her life. Those years were precious to me. Teaching Lynette to bake in my kitchen, helping with her homework at my dining table, listening to her teenage dreams while we painted the walls of my newest acquisition together. "Grandma," she once said while we scraped old wallpaper, "I want to be just like you when I grow up." How quickly those sentiments would change. As Lynette entered her 20s, she began to distance herself from me. The properties I owned were no longer charming projects we worked on together, but embarrassing reminders of her grandmother's common background. When she met Tobias Harrington, whose family owned a chain of luxury hotels, the transformation was complete. Suddenly, my granddaughter, who once proudly helped me install kitchen cabinets, now winced when I mentioned my latest renovation. I saw less and less of her, receiving occasional phone calls that grew shorter and more perfunctory. Then came the dinner at Victoria's house last Christmas, where Lynette announced her engagement, deliberately avoiding my gaze as she described the lavish wedding they were planning. "We're trying to book Rosewood Estate," she gushed to the table. "Tobias's parents know the owners. Well, they think they do." I nearly choked on my wine. 5 years earlier, I had purchased Rosewood through a holding company, keeping my ownership private to avoid the social complications that came with being known as the landlady in our small town. The elegant Georgian mansion on 50 acres of manicured gardens had been my most significant investment, one I'd made thinking it might someday host family weddings. I never imagined I would be excluded from the first one. After dinner, I overheard Lynette whispering to her mother in the kitchen. "Mom, you have to help me with Grandma. You know how she is. She'll show up in one of her thrift store dresses talking about plumbing fixtures and property values." Tobias's family are sophisticated people. His mother is on the board of the symphony. For heaven's sake, Victoria's response surprised me. Lynette, your grandmother built everything we have. She paid for your private school, your college education. I know, Lynette interrupted. And I'm grateful, really. But this is my day? Can't you just tell her it's a very small ceremony? We'll visit her afterward or something. The pain of those words stayed with me as I drove home that night to my simple apartment above the hardware store. Another property I owned, but kept modest by choice. I had lived frugally my whole life, reinvesting profits rather than splurging on luxuries. Even after Augustine passed away 10 years ago, I maintained my habits, preferring function over flash. This mindset had made me wealthy, but to Lynette, it made me embarrassing. 2 months later, the wedding invitations went out. Victoria called me, her voice strained. Mother, I need to talk to you about Lynette's wedding. Let me guess, I'm not invited, I said quietly. Her silence was confirmation enough. She's young and foolish, Victoria finally said. She's trying to impress Tobias's family. And what's your excuse? I asked, surprised by the steel in my voice. That same afternoon, my phone rang again. It was Rosewood's manager, Claudine. Mrs. Barrett, I have a gentleman named Tobias Harrington on the other line. He's inquiring about booking the estate for a wedding in June. Apparently, the venue they reserved fell through, and they're desperate. I explained we're fully booked, but he mentioned connections to some of your business associates. I paused, considering my response carefully. For 40 years, I had put my family first. I had swallowed my pride when Augustine's business failed, when Victoria's husband left her for a younger woman, when Philip moved across the country and rarely called. I had been the steady foundation they all relied upon while treating me like an embarrassing secret. Perhaps it was finally time they understood who I really was. Tell Mr. Harrington that the owner might be willing to make an exception, I said slowly. But I'll need to meet with the couple personally to discuss arrangements. Set up an appointment for tomorrow afternoon. Of course, Mrs. Barrett, Claudine replied. Should I tell them your name? I smiled, though no one could see it. No, just tell them the owner of Rosewood Estate would be delighted to discuss their special day. That night, I pulled out my best dress, not from a thrift store as Lynette had cruelly suggested, but a classic Chanel I had purchased to celebrate my first million. Tomorrow would change everything. Tomorrow, my granddaughter would learn that the grandmother she was ashamed to invite to her wedding owned the venue of her dreams. My path to owning Rosewood Estate began long before Lynette was born, in the days when I scrubbed my own floors and fixed leaking pipes with tools borrowed from neighbors. Those early years shaped everything I would become. I grew up watching my parents work themselves to exhaustion on other people's land. Never put your destiny in someone else's hands. Honora, my father would say as we walked the fields together. He died of a heart attack at 42, leaving my mother and me with nothing but memories and unpaid medical bills. At 18, I met Augustine Barrett at a dance in the church basement. He was handsome and ambitious, with dreams of starting his own construction company. We married 6 months later, moving into a 1-bedroom rental with a leaky roof and unreliable heat. Augustine worked construction during the day while I typed letters for a local attorney, both of us saving every penny for his business. When I discovered I was pregnant with Victoria, we were overjoyed but terrified. Our apartment was barely suitable for 2, let alone a baby. That's when I noticed the abandoned cottage 3 blocks away. The owners had died, and their children had moved to the city, leaving the property to deteriorate. We could buy it, I suggested to Augustine one evening as we walked past it. He laughed. With what money, Honora? We're saving for the business. But I had been watching the real estate listings. I knew the price had dropped 3 times. That night, I emptied my personal savings, money I'd been secretly setting aside from my paycheck each week, and made an offer well below asking price. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To my surprise, they accepted. Augustine was furious. "You spent our future on a collapsing shack," he shouted. But I had a vision he couldn't see. For 6 months, I spent every evening and weekend at that cottage. I learned to replace broken windows from a library book, to patch plaster from the elderly handyman at the hardware store. By the time Victoria was born, we had a modest but solid home of our own. 2 years later, I sold it for twice what we'd paid and bought 2 more properties needing work. Augustine's construction business floundered despite his hard work. He couldn't manage the finances, couldn't price jobs properly. Meanwhile, I was pregnant with Philip and worried about our future. When Augustine lost our savings on a large project where the client went bankrupt, I made a decision that would define our marriage. "I'll handle the money from now on," I told him quietly one night after the children were asleep. "You build, I'll manage." His pride was wounded, but he couldn't argue with my results. While raising Victoria and Philip, I continued buying neglected properties, learning every aspect of renovation hands-on. Augustine and his crew would help with the major work, but I was there every step of the way, hanging drywall, installing kitchen cabinets, painting until midnight. The children grew up amid the smell of sawdust and fresh paint. Victoria complained about spending weekends at work sites while her friends went shopping. Philip, however, absorbed everything, following Augustine around with a toy hammer, later working summers with the crew. By the time Victoria was in high school, we owned 12 rental properties, all managed by me. "Why do we still live in this small house when we own all these buildings?" Victoria would ask, embarrassed by our modest home while her friends lived in new subdivisions. I never told her that the mortgage on our home had been paid off years earlier, that the money from our properties was invested in their education, funds in retirement accounts for Augustine and me, in new properties that would secure our family's future. I never mentioned the account balances I checked each night, watching our net worth climb while we continued to live simply. When Victoria met Gerard Lawson in college, I saw trouble immediately. He was charming but entitled, the son of a banker, who had never worked for anything in his life. Augustine thought he hung the moon. I reserved judgment, quietly continuing my property acquisitions while their romance blossomed. They married in a lavish ceremony that Gerard's parents insisted on paying for. "We can contribute," I offered to Victoria, who looked at me like I'd suggested holding the reception in one of my rental kitchens. "Mom, the Lawsons have standards," she said. "Just wear something nice and try not to mention your buildings." Wore a designer dress I found at a consignment shop and bit my tongue through the entire event while the Lawsons treated Augustine and me like quaint country relatives. 6 months later, when Gerard and Victoria wanted to buy their first home, they came to me for help with the down payment. I wrote the check without comment, watching Victoria become exactly what she had always wanted, a woman who didn't have to think about money. Philip took a different path, working construction with Augustine through college, then moving to Seattle for a job with an architectural firm. He called regularly, understanding the value of what we had built in a way Victoria never did. "You were right all along, Mom," he told me once. "Property is the only thing they aren't making more of." When Augustine's health began failing in our 50s, I gradually took over the construction business as well. The crews who had once looked skeptically at the boss's wife now took their orders directly from me. I sold the business when Augustine became too ill to work, focusing entirely on property management and acquisition. By the time Lynette was born, Augustine and I had achieved a level of wealth that would have seemed impossible in our early days. But old habits die hard. We still lived modestly, still drove sensible cars, still thought twice before spending on luxuries. Victoria saw this as stinginess. I saw it as the very mindset that had built everything we had. Everything changed when Victoria's marriage collapsed. Gerard left her for his 26-year-old secretary, emptying their joint accounts on his way out the door. Victoria arrived at our doorstep one rainy night, 3-year-old Lynette in tow, mascara streaming down. Her face. "He said I was boring," she sobbed as Augustine made tea. "He said I cared more about appearances than passion." I bit back the observation that Gerard had never been worthy of her in the first place. Instead, I held my daughter while Augustine entertained Lynette with silly faces and stories. That night, as Victoria slept in her childhood bedroom, I made a promise to myself that neither she nor my granddaughter would ever want for anything. The next morning, I called my attorney. By afternoon, Victoria had an appointment with the best divorce lawyer in the state, paid for by me. By the end of the week, I had contacted a real estate agent about a small house 3 blocks from ours where Victoria and Lynette could start fresh. "I can't afford a mortgage," Victoria protested when I showed her the listing. "You won't have one," I replied simply. "Consider it an investment in my girls." For the next 5 years, while Victoria rebuilt her career at the local bank, I became a second mother to Lynette. I picked her up from preschool 3 days a week, taught her to read at my kitchen table, bandaged her knees when she fell. On weekends, she accompanied me to property inspections, wearing a tiny hard hat I had specially made. "Is this one ours, Grandma?" she would ask, skipping through empty rooms that smelled of possibility. "Not yet," I would answer, "but it could be." Unlike her mother at that age, Lynette showed genuine interest in my work. She loved choosing paint colors, helping me measure for curtains, even learning to use a screwdriver to install switch plates. By age 8, she could calculate square footage in her head and knew the difference between load-bearing and cosmetic walls. When Augustine passed away the year Lynette turned 10, I channeled my grief into my business and my granddaughter. Our weekend projects became more ambitious. We renovated a small office building together, Lynette designing the reception area as her special project. When the first tenants moved in, I framed her hand-drawn floor plan and hung it in the lobby. "When I grow up," she told me solemnly at 12, "I want to build beautiful places like you do, Grandma." Those were the golden years, working side by side with my granddaughter, watching her confidence grow along with her skills. I paid for private school, for summer architecture camps, for art lessons when she showed talent for design. Victoria didn't object, relieved to have both emotional and financial support as a single mother. The idea for Rosewood Estate came during those years, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Lynette and I were driving back from looking at a commercial property when we passed the old Whitmore mansion on the outskirts of town. Once the grandest home in the county, it had fallen into disrepair after the last Whitmore died without heirs. "That would make the most beautiful wedding venue," Lynette said, pressing her face against the car window, "like something from a fairy tale." "It would cost a fortune to restore," I replied practically. "But imagine the weddings you could have there," she insisted. "Everyone in town would want to get married at Rosewood." The seed was planted. Over the next few years, I made discreet inquiries about the property, learning that it had been tied up in probate for nearly a decade. Meanwhile, I continued building my portfolio, focusing increasingly on higher-end properties that would appreciate substantially. Lynette's transformation began during her sophomore year of college. She'd chosen to attend the prestigious Langford University, 2 hours away, close enough to visit, but far enough to experience independence. I'd paid her tuition in full, set up a modest monthly allowance, and helped her find a comfortable apartment near campus. Victoria worried I was spoiling her, but I saw it as an investment in her future. "She needs to focus on her studies," I told Victoria. "Not on working part-time jobs like we did." For the first year, Lynette called weekly, visited monthly, and continued to show interest in my latest projects. She was studying interior design with a minor in business. A perfect combination for eventually joining my company, I thought. During winter and summer breaks, she still accompanied me to properties, offering increasingly sophisticated insights about layouts and finishes. Then came the alumni gala. Victoria couldn't attend, but I gladly accompanied Lynette to the black tie event where students networked with successful graduates. I wore a simple but elegant black dress, designer but understated, as was my way. Lynette seemed uncharacteristically nervous as we entered the grand ballroom. "There are some really important people here, Grandma," she whispered. "The Harringtons might be here. They own like half the luxury hotels on the East Coast." I squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Just be yourself. You have nothing to prove to anyone." But I soon realized Lynette had other ideas about the evening. When introduced to the dean of the design school, she mentioned her family's interest in real estate, but quickly steered the conversation toward her coursework, never once mentioning the practical experience she'd gained working alongside me. Later, when I began telling a prominent architect about the structural challenges we'd overcome in renovating the old factory building downtown, Lynette deftly changed the subject. "Grandma loves her little projects," she said with a laugh that made my heart contract. "I'm more interested in large-scale commercial design. Little projects." The factory renovation had been a $3.2 million undertaking that had transformed an abandoned industrial eyesore into the most sought-after office space in town. But I held my tongue, watching my granddaughter navigate the room with increasing confidence and increasing distance from me. Then I met Tobias Harrington. Tall, conventionally handsome, with the easy confidence of someone who has never worried about money. He approached as I stood alone at the edge of the room, Lynette having drifted away to chat with classmates. "You must be Mrs. Barrett," he said, extending his hand. "Lynette has told me about you." "All good things, I hope," I replied with a smile. "Oh, yes. She mentioned you have quite the collection of rental properties in your hometown. My family's in real estate as well, though on a somewhat different scale." The condescension in his tone was subtle, but unmistakable. Before I could respond, Lynette appeared at his side, her eyes widening with something close to panic. "Tobias, I see you've met my grandmother." Her hand slipped through his arm possessively. "Grandma was just about to get some fresh air, weren't you?" I recognized the dismissal for what it was. "Actually, I was about to tell Mr. Harrington about the Rosewood property I've been considering," I said calmly. "Oh, Grandma has her eye on this old rundown mansion," Lynette explained hurriedly. "It's a bit of a fantasy project." "Not so rundown. Or fantastical," I corrected gently. "The Whitmore Estate. I've been watching it for years." Tobias's eyebrows rose. "Whitmore? As in Rosewood Estate?" "My parents looked at that property a few years back. Decided against it. Too much work for too little return." Charming idea, though. The conversation moved on, but something had fundamentally shifted. I watched Lynette that evening, laughing too brightly at Tobias's jokes, deferring to his opinions, minimizing her connection to me. I saw her becoming Victoria all over again, ashamed of the very foundation that had given her every advantage. In the months that followed, Lynette's calls became less frequent, her visits home rare and hurried. When she did come, she brought stories of weekend trips to Tobias's family estate in the Berkshires, gallery openings in New York, sailing excursions on his father's yacht. Our shared projects were set aside, replaced by a world I had never sought to enter. During her senior year, I rarely saw her at all. The few times we spoke, she seemed distracted, mentioning internship opportunities at prestigious firms, always somehow connected to Tobias's family connections. I continued to pay her expenses without comment, watched from a distance as she was gradually absorbed into the Harrington orbit. Meanwhile, I channeled my disappointment into action. After years of waiting, the Whitmore property, Rosewood Estate, finally became available. The price was steep even for me, but I saw potential others missed. I created a holding company to purchase it, hiding my ownership behind layers of corporate paperwork. It wasn't that I was ashamed of owning it. I simply preferred to keep my business affairs private, as I always had. For 2 years, I poured resources into restoring Rosewood to its former glory. I hired the best historical preservationists, landscape architects, and craftsmen. What had once been a decrepit mansion became a stunning estate, with formal gardens, a renovated carriage house, and interiors that balanced historical accuracy with modern comfort. The ballroom, with its soaring ceilings and wall of French doors, opening onto a stone terrace, was breathtaking. When local wedding planners approached about using the estate as a venue, I recognized an opportunity. Within a year, Rosewood became the most exclusive wedding venue in 3 counties, booked solid 18 months in advance. I rarely visited in person, letting Claudine, my capable manager, handle the day-to-day operations. My name appeared nowhere, in the marketing materials. The estate was simply owned by Barrett Holdings LLC. I took a certain satisfaction in this secret success, especially as Lynette drifted further away. After graduation, she took a position at a design firm in the city, a position I suspected had more to do with Tobias's influence than her portfolio. Her calls home became even more infrequent. Her comments about my outdated design sense more pointed. "You really should update your apartment, Grandma," she said during one rare visit. "Those cabinets must be 20 years old." I didn't tell her that I had deliberately kept my personal living space modest and practical. Why explain that the apartment above the hardware store was simply convenient, allowing me to check on one of my commercial properties daily? Or that I preferred to invest in appreciating assets rather than fashionable furnishings? The truth was, Lynette no longer wanted to understand my choices. She had chosen a different path. Then came the Christmas dinner at Victoria's house, where Lynette announced her engagement to Tobias with a ring that could have paid for one of my first houses. As the family exclaimed over the diamond, I watched, my granddaughter's face, searching for traces of the girl who had once helped me install cabinet hinges and calculate paint quantities. Instead, I saw a stranger, one who carefully avoided my eyes as she described the lavish wedding they were planning at Rosewood Estate. The wedding invitations arrived on a Tuesday in early April. Victoria called that evening, her voice unnaturally bright as she described the heavy cream envelopes with gold foil lettering. "So elegant, Mother. Lynette said they cost nearly $30 each." "I'm sure they're lovely," I replied, waiting for her to acknowledge what we both knew, that my invitation was conspicuously absent. The silence stretched between us before Victoria finally sighed. "Mother, about the wedding." "I noticed I haven't received an invitation," I said quietly, saving her the discomfort of having to explain. "It's not what you think," Victoria began, though we both knew it was exactly what I thought. "Lynette and Tobias are keeping it very intimate. His parents have certain expectations about the guest list. And those expectations don't include the bride's grandmother?" Victoria's voice dropped to a whisper. "The Harringtons are very particular about appearances. Tobias's father is a state senator now, and his mother chairs 3 different charitable foundations. They're inviting some very prominent people, and I'm not prominent enough," I finished for her. The pain was sharp but not surprising. I had watched this transformation happening for years, my granddaughter slowly severing ties with the parts of her life that didn't fit her new image. "It's not that," Victoria protested weakly. "It's just that Lynette feels you might not be comfortable in such formal surroundings. You've always preferred simpler gatherings." I almost laughed at the absurdity. I, who had negotiated multi-million-dollar real estate deals and managed a portfolio of properties that would make most investors envious, was supposedly too unsophisticated for a wedding reception. "I see," was all I said. "Mother, please understand. This is important to Lynette. The Harringtons are opening doors for her career that would normally take years to access. At the cost of her integrity," I observed. "That's unfair," Victoria said, her voice hardening. "She's just trying to fit into their world." "By pretending she doesn't come from ours," I replied. We ended the call with artificial pleasantries, both aware of the fracture that had just widened between us. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table, absently tracing the small scratch in the wood where Lynette had once pressed too hard with her pencil while doing homework. The same table where I'd taught her to measure ingredients for cookies, where we'd spread out blueprints for our weekend projects, where she'd once proudly announced she wanted to be just like me when she grew up. I might have let it go, might have accepted the exclusion with quiet dignity, sent a generous gift, and waited for Lynette to eventually realize what she had thrown away. But fate had other plans. The next morning, Claudine called from Rosewood Estate. "Mrs. Barrett, we have a situation with a wedding booking. The Harrington Barrett wedding in June?" They had originally booked the Sanderson Hotel downtown, but apparently, there's been a major plumbing issue that won't be resolved in time. They're now desperate to book Rosewood, but as you know, we're completely reserved through September. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. "The Harrington Barrett wedding," I repeated slowly. "That would be Tobias Harrington and Lynette Barrett?" "Yes, that's right," Claudine confirmed. "I explained we're fully booked, but Mr. Harrington was quite insistent. He mentioned his father knows Senator Gladwell, who apparently attended an event at Rosewood last fall and is an investor in some of your other properties." Of course. Tobias was trying to use connections to pressure the unknown owner of Rosewood, me, into accommodating his wedding plans. The irony was almost too perfect. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That I would need to consult with the owner. He's holding on the other line, actually. Shall I tell him it's not possible?" I paused, considering. My options. I could simply decline, cite existing bookings, and let Lynette and Tobias scramble to find another venue. It would be perfectly reasonable, and perhaps a small taste of karmic justice for a granddaughter who had deemed me unworthy of attending her wedding. But another idea began to form, one that would reveal the truth in a way no one could ignore. T4. "Mr. Harrington that the owner might be willing to make an exception," I said slowly. "But I'll need to meet with the couple personally to discuss arrangements. Set up an appointment for tomorrow afternoon." "Of course, Mrs. Barrett," Claudine replied. "Should I tell them your name?" "No," I said after a moment. "Just tell them the owner of Rosewood Estate would be delighted to discuss their special day." After hanging up, I walked to my closet and pushed aside the practical clothes I wore for property inspections and tenant meetings. At the back hung the few designer pieces I had allowed myself over the years. Investments for important business negotiations rather than everyday wear. I pulled out a cream Armani suit I had purchased for signing the Rosewood deal but had never worn. Tomorrow would be its debut. That evening, my phone rang repeatedly. Victoria, then Lynette, then Victoria again. I let the calls go to voicemail, listening as their messages grew increasingly excited about the possibility of securing Rosewood Estate after all. Not once did either of them mention my exclusion from the wedding. Not once did they connect the dots between my surname and the mysterious owner of Rosewood who might accommodate their last-minute request. "Grandma, it's Lynette. I have amazing news. The owner of Rosewood Estate might let us book for June. Tobias says it's practically unheard of. We have a meeting tomorrow with the owner. I'm so nervous. This place is absolutely perfect. I've dreamed of getting married there since I was a little girl. Call me back when you get this." I smiled sadly at the irony. She had indeed first dreamed of Rosewood as a wedding venue when she was little, sitting beside me in my car, imagining its potential long before I had transformed that potential into reality. Now she would see it through adult eyes, never knowing how her childhood dream had influenced my decision to purchase and restore the estate. In bed that night, I thought about what tomorrow would bring. The shock on Lynette's face when she realized who owned the venue she coveted. The awkward explanations she would have to make to Tobias and his family. Part of me felt a guilty anticipation at the comeuppance, but mostly I felt a profound sadness. When had my sweet, curious granddaughter, the one who had once been so proud of our shared projects, become someone who would exclude me from one of the most important days of her life. As I drifted toward sleep, I wondered if tomorrow's revelation would bridge the growing chasm between us or widen it beyond repair. Either way, the truth would finally be laid bare. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lynette's face, not as the poised, image-conscious young woman she had become, but as the little girl who had once followed me through half-renovated houses, asking endless questions about load-bearing walls and proper insulation, the child who had been so proud to help me choose paint colors and cabinet hardware, the teenager who had sketched her first design concepts at my kitchen table. When had I lost her? When had my granddaughter decided I was something to be ashamed of rather than someone to be proud of? I rose before dawn, making coffee in the same chipped mug I'd used for 20 years. My apartment above the hardware store was modest but comfortable. Hardwood floors I had refinished myself, kitchen cabinets I had installed with Augustine before his health failed, windows that overlooked the town square where I had built or renovated nearly half the buildings. This was my world, the one I had created through decades of hard work and careful investment. The one Lynette now found embarrassing. As I dressed in my cream Armani suit, applied subtle makeup, and styled my silver hair, I tried to prepare myself emotionally for the confrontation to come. Would Lynette be mortified? Angry? Would she see the irony in seeking the perfect venue from the very grandmother she had deemed unworthy to attend? Or would she simply see it as another opportunity to leverage our connection for her benefit, without acknowledging the hurtful exclusion? My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Lynette is so excited about Rosewood. Thank you for pulling strings, Mother. I knew you'd understand how important this is to her." The message stopped me cold. Victoria thought I had somehow intervened to help secure the venue, using my connections to benefit the granddaughter who had excluded me. She assumed I would simply accept my role as the helpful but invisible benefactor, providing advantages while remaining tactfully out of sight. A fresh wave of pain washed over me, so intense I had to sit on the edge of my bed. It wasn't just Lynette's rejection that hurt. It was Victoria's complicity in it. My own daughter, whom I had supported through divorce and single motherhood, now expected me to quietly accept being erased from one of the most significant family events. I drove to Rosewood Estate with my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The winding driveway lined with century-old oaks was especially beautiful in spring, with dogwoods and redbuds blooming beneath the larger trees. I had personally overseen the restoration of the grounds, insisting on historically accurate landscaping, while adding subtle modern lighting and irrigation. Claudine met me at the service entrance, her expression concerned. "They're waiting in the main parlor, Mrs. Barrett. The young lady has been walking through the rooms, exclaiming over every detail. She seems particularly enchanted with the garden terrace." "Does she know who she's meeting?" I asked. "No, I've been careful not to mention your name, though I must say the resemblance between you and the bride is quite noticeable. I'm surprised they haven't made the connection." "People often see what they expect to see," I replied, smoothing my jacket. "And they certainly aren't expecting me." I asked Claudine to give me a moment before announcing me. Standing alone in the hallway, I gazed at my reflection in the antique mirror I had personally restored. The woman looking back seemed both familiar and strange, dressed in expensive clothes I rarely wore, about to confront the painful truth that my own granddaughter was ashamed of me. For a moment, I considered retreating. I could send Claudine in with some excuse about the owner being unavailable. I could have her offer the venue as a generous gesture, allowing Lynette her perfect day without the awkwardness of confrontation. It would be easier, certainly. More dignified, perhaps. But it would solve nothing. The rift would remain, possibly widen, as Lynette continued to compartmentalize her life, the ambitious young designer engaged to a Harrington, completely separate from the granddaughter of a self-made property investor who lived above a hardware store. I heard Lynette's voice through the partially open door, bright with excitement. The moldings are exquisite, exactly the kind of historical detail I've been telling you about, Tobias. Whoever restored this place had incredible taste. That whoever was me, the grandmother whose taste she had recently dismissed as outdated. Took a deep breath and nodded to Claudine, who stepped into the parlor. Ms. Barrett, Mr. Harrington, the owner of Rosewood Estate, is here to meet with you. I entered the room with my head high, watching as Lynette's expression transformed from eager anticipation to shocked recognition. The color drained from her face, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. "Grandma?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tobias looked between us, confusion evident in his furrowed brow. "You know each other?" "You could say that," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "Lynette is my granddaughter." Time seemed to stop as understanding dawned on Tobias's face. He turned to Lynette, whose complexion had now flushed from pale to crimson. "Your grandmother owns Rosewood Estate?" he asked incredulously. "But you said—" "I think what Lynette told you," I interrupted gently, "is that her grandmother owns some rental properties in town. Which is true as far as it goes. Rosewood is just one of several properties in my portfolio." Lynette seemed unable to speak, her eyes fixed on me with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something else. Was it guilt? Fear? I couldn't tell. "Mrs. Barrett, this is unexpected." Tobias recovered quickly, extending his hand. "Lynette has mentioned you, of course, but she never indicated you were— that is, that you owned— that I owned the venue you're so desperate to secure for your wedding?" I finished for him. "The wedding to which I wasn't invited?" The words hung in the air between us. Tobias's hand dropped slowly to his side, his confident demeanor faltering. "There's been a misunderstanding." Lynette finally managed, her voice thin. "We were planning to invite you, of course, but your future in-laws might find me embarrassing," I said quietly. "A grandmother who works with her hands, who lives modestly, who doesn't fit the image you're trying to project." Tears welled in Lynette's eyes. Whether they were tears of shame at being caught or genuine remorse, I couldn't tell. The bright, curious granddaughter I had adored was now a stranger to me, her priorities and values as foreign as another language. In that moment, with the sunlight streaming through the restored Victorian windows I had personally sourced from a salvage yard, the full weight of her rejection hit me. This wasn't just about a wedding invitation. It was about a fundamental denial of who I was, who we were together. It was a repudiation of everything I had built, everything I had taught her, everything we had once shared. "I think," I said after a long silence, "that we have a lot to discuss about your wedding plans." After the initial shock of our meeting at Rosewood, I suggested we continue our conversation the following day. Lynette needed time to process the revelation, and I needed space to collect my thoughts. Tobias, ever the diplomat, agreed that everyone could use a moment to regroup, as he put it. "We'll call you tomorrow, Mrs. Barrett," he said smoothly, guiding a still-stunned Lynette toward the door. "Perhaps we can discuss this over lunch." I nodded, maintaining my composure until their car disappeared down the long driveway. Only then did I allow my shoulders to slump, the weight of the confrontation finally settling fully upon me. "Are you all right, Mrs. Barrett?" Claudine asked, concern evident in her voice. "I will be," I assured her, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Rather than returning to my apartment, I asked Claudine to cancel my afternoon appointments. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, how deep Lynette's rejection went, what she had told the Harringtons about me, and whether there was anything left of our relationship worth salvaging. I began by calling Philip in Seattle. My son had always been more perceptive than Victoria, less concerned with appearances and more grounded in reality. If anyone would give me an honest assessment, it would be him. "Mom?" he answered, surprised to hear from me midweek. Everything okay? I explained the situation as succinctly as possible. Lynette's exclusion of me from the wedding, my ownership of Rosewood, and the confrontation that had just occurred. Philip was quiet for a long moment before sighing heavily. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but I'm not. Lynette sent me an invitation last week with a note saying it was adults only and explaining why you wouldn't be there. What exactly did she say? I pressed, needing to hear the full extent of her deception. That you were having mobility issues and wouldn't be comfortable at such a formal event, Philip said reluctantly. That you and she had discussed it, and you were relieved not to have to attend. The lie stung worse than the exclusion itself. Not only had Lynette decided I was unworthy of attending her wedding, but she had fabricated a story to justify my absence to other family members. Mom, I should have questioned it, Philip continued, regret evident in his voice. But Jamie and I have been so caught up in the adoption process, and Lynette sounded so convincing. I'm sorry. It's not your fault, I assured him. But I'd appreciate if you didn't mention our conversation to Lynette or Victoria just yet. I need to understand what else Lynette has been saying about me. After promising to visit soon, Philip ended the call, leaving me with a hollow feeling in my chest. What other lies had Lynette told to erase me from her narrative? My next call was to my old friend Meredith, whose granddaughter was in the same social circle as Lynette. Meredith had been my confidant since our children were in elementary school together, one of the few people who knew the true extent of my business success. Honora, what perfect timing! I was just about to call you, Meredith exclaimed. I ran into Lynette at the country club yesterday. She was having lunch with Tobias's mother and some of the ladies from the hospital board. The country club? I repeated, surprised. Lynette had never shown interest in country club activities before. Yes, she's joined the Young Professionals Committee there. Didn't she tell you? No, I said simply. We haven't been in close contact lately. Did she happen to mention me? Meredith hesitated, which told me everything I needed to know. Well, one of the ladies asked about her family background, and she mentioned her mother works at First National Bank. When Mrs. Harrington asked about her father's side, Lynette said her paternal grandparents were both deceased, and her maternal grandmother had been a receptionist who was now retired and living quietly. A receptionist, living quietly. Not a lie, exactly, but so far from the whole truth that it might as well have been. I had indeed worked as a receptionist decades ago, while building my real estate business on the side, but to reduce my entire life's work to that early job was a deliberate minimization. Did she mention anything about the wedding? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Only that it would be at Rosewood Estate. Mrs. Harrington seemed quite impressed that they'd secured it. Said her husband had tried to buy the property years ago, but couldn't reach an agreement with the owners. Lynette looked quite pleased with herself. After ending the call with Meredith, I drove to Victoria's house, not to confront her but to observe. I parked down the street, watching as Victoria arrived home from work. The house, which I had helped her purchase after the divorce, was modest but in an upscale neighborhood, perfect for a bank manager's salary. What struck me now was how she hurried inside without acknowledging the elderly neighbor watering his garden, how she carried herself with a stiffness that reminded me of how she had been after marrying Gerard. As twilight settled over the neighborhood, I saw Lynette's car pull into the driveway. She and Victoria embraced briefly before hurrying inside, their body language suggesting urgency. I could imagine the conversation. Lynette explaining the shocking discovery that her grandmother owned Rosewood, Victoria expressing disbelief, or perhaps calculating how this might actually work to their advantage. I drove to my building downtown, but instead of going up to my apartment, I entered the small office on the ground floor that served as headquarters for Barrett Properties. It was after hours, but my assistant Anita was still there, organizing files for our upcoming tax preparations. Mrs. Barrett, I wasn't expecting you this evening, she said, looking up from her desk. I need to see something, Anita. Can you pull the files on all the properties I've purchased for Victoria and Lynette? And the education accounts? Anita raised an eyebrow but didn't question further. She had been with me for 15 years and knew most of my family's financial arrangements. Within minutes, she had laid out the relevant folders on the conference table. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing the documentation of my financial support for my daughter and granddaughter over the years. Victoria's house, purchased outright, in my name, and transferred to her for a nominal sum. Lynette's education fund, which had paid for private school, and her entire college education without loans. The startup funds I had set aside for Lynette's eventual design business, which she had never asked about. The trust that would one day make both of them independently wealthy, which they knew nothing about. It wasn't that I needed reminders of. My generosity, I had never kept score or expected gratitude. But I needed to understand the full context of Lynette's rejection. She wasn't just excluding a grandmother with unfashionable clothes or embarrassing mannerisms. She was rejecting someone who had quietly secured her past, present, and future. Someone who had been building a legacy for her since before she was born. As I locked the office and finally headed upstairs to my apartment, I felt a strange clarity emerging from the pain. This wasn't just about a wedding invitation or social embarrassment. It was about values, about the fundamental disconnect between the life I had built and the image Lynette was now trying to project. Tomorrow's lunch with Lynette and Tobias would be illuminating in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. But first, I needed to make one more call to Jamie, Philip's husband, who worked for a private investigation firm. I need information on the Harrington family, I told him when he answered, particularly their current financial situation. Honora, is everything okay? Jamie asked, concern evident in his voice. Not yet, I replied, but it will be. One way or another, it will be. The restaurant Tobias chose for our meeting was predictably upscale, the kind of place where the menu has no prices and the waitstaff hovers just out of sight. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in another of my rarely worn designer outfits, this time a sapphire blue St. John knit suit that brought out the blue of my eyes. The maitre d' led me to a private alcove in the back, clearly reserved for important guests. I had barely settled in when Jamie called with the information I'd requested. It's not what you might expect, he said without preamble. The Harringtons maintain all the appearances of wealth, but they're leveraged to the hilt. Their hotel chain has been losing market share to boutique hotels and high-end vacation rentals. The senators' campaigns have drained their liquid assets, and there are some questionable tax maneuvers my contacts are flagging. They're broke? I asked, surprised despite myself. Not broke, but not nearly as solid as they appear. They're keeping up appearances, but behind the scenes, they're scrambling. That might explain why the son is so eager to marry into what he perceives as new money. Except Lynette doesn't have money, I pointed out. Not yet, anyway. But she's positioned herself as someone who does, hasn't she? My guess is she's been vague about her family's finances, letting the Harringtons assume there's significant wealth. And now, with the discovery that you own Rosewood Estate. I thanked Jamie and ended the call just as I saw Lynette and Tobias enter the restaurant. My granddaughter had changed clothes at least twice since yesterday. Her outfit now, an expensive-looking cream pantsuit with a silk blouse, her hair swept into an elegant updo. She looked polished, poised, and completely different from the girl who had once helped me install kitchen cabinets in overalls and a baseball cap. I watched them approach, noting how Tobias guided Lynette with a hand at the small of her back, how she leaned slightly toward him as if seeking strength. Their body language told me they had strategized this meeting, prepared a united front. "Grandma," Lynette said as they reached the table, leaning down to kiss my cheek, a gesture so formal and artificial it made my heart ache. "You look lovely." "Thank you," I replied, gesturing for them to sit. I thought the occasion warranted something special. "Mrs. Barrett," Tobias began smoothly, once we had ordered drinks. I want to apologize for yesterday's awkwardness. Had we known you owned Rosewood Estate, you would have invited me to the wedding. I finished for him, my tone mild but direct. He had the grace to flush slightly. There's been a misunderstanding about the guest list. Lynette and I were planning to discuss it with you, actually. I raised an eyebrow, waiting for Lynette to speak. She fidgeted with her water glass, avoiding my gaze. Grandma, it's not what you think, she finally said, her voice carefully modulated to sound sincere. We were trying to keep the ceremony very small, just immediate family and a few close friends. Your brother and his husband received invitations, I pointed out. As did your mother, your cousins from your father's side, and judging by the number of invitations Victoria mentioned, at least 100 of the Harringtons' closest acquaintances. Lynette flushed. That's different. Tobias's family has certain obligations. Political connections. I nodded understandingly. People who could help the senator's career or the hotel business. Tobias's eyes narrowed slightly at my mention of the hotel business, but his smile never faltered. Mrs. Barrett, what Lynette is trying to say is that we would love for you to attend the wedding. In fact, now that we know about your connection to Rosewood, it seems providential. Perhaps we could discuss special arrangements for the venue. And there it was, the pivot from exclusion to opportunism. Now that I might be useful, I was suddenly welcome at the celebration. Special arrangements? I echoed, taking a sip of my water. What did you have in mind? Lynette brightened, clearly thinking the worst was over. Well, since you own the venue, maybe we could get a family discount, and perhaps extend the hours a bit longer than usual? The Rosewood contract is pretty restrictive about end times, but since it's your own granddaughter's wedding, I let her continue, watching as she and Tobias outlined their vision for the perfect wedding at Rosewood, more guests than the venue. Typically allowed, extended hours, special access to areas of the estate usually closed to the public, and of course, a substantial discount on the already exorbitant fee. They spoke animatedly, their earlier discomfort forgotten as they described flower arrangements and lighting designs, menu options and music selections. Not once did either of them acknowledge the fundamental issue, that they had deliberately excluded me from this celebration until they discovered I controlled something they wanted. As our entrees arrived, I finally interrupted their planning. Before we discuss the venue further, I'd like to understand something. Lynette, why did you tell Philip I was having mobility issues and couldn't attend your wedding? Her fork froze halfway to her mouth, her eyes widening. That was just to make things easier for everyone. I didn't want him to worry. And why did you tell Meredith's granddaughter that both your paternal grandparents were deceased and I was a retired receptionist, living quietly? Tobias shot Lynette a quick glance, clearly surprised by this information. I never said. Lynette began to deny, then stopped, realizing I wouldn't have mentioned it without certainty. That was just simplified for casual conversation. You know how people ask questions without really wanting detailed answers. I see, I said, folding my napkin carefully. And which version of me were you planning to present at the wedding, now that I'm invited? The infirm grandmother who can't navigate a formal event? The retired receptionist with no accomplishments worth mentioning? Or the owner of Rosewood Estate, suddenly worthy of acknowledgement? The facade cracked then, just slightly. Lynette's carefully maintained poise faltered, her eyes filling with tears that I suspected were as much from frustration as remorse. Grandma, that's not fair. I've been under so much pressure with the wedding planning and my career and meeting Tobias's family's expectations. Expectations that apparently couldn't accommodate your grandmother as she actually is, I finished for her. Tobias cleared his throat, clearly trying to salvage the situation. Mrs. Barrett, whatever misunderstandings have occurred, I'm sure we can move past them. Family is important to both Lynette and me. In fact, my parents are very eager to meet you now. Now that they know I own Rosewood, I added. Now that they "No, you're a successful businesswoman," he corrected smoothly. "Your achievements should be celebrated, not hidden." I almost admired his ability to pivot so effortlessly, to reframe Lynette's deception as a simple oversight now happily corrected. If I hadn't spent decades negotiating with far more seasoned business people, I might have been persuaded by his charm. Instead, I took another bite of my barely touched salmon, chewed thoughtfully, and swallowed before responding. "Tell me more about your parents' interest in Rosewood Estate. I understand your father tried to purchase it some years ago." A flicker of surprise crossed Tobias's face before he composed himself. "Yes, it would have made an excellent addition to our hotel portfolio. Unfortunately, the negotiations fell through." "Because the asking price was too high," I suggested. "Because the owners were unreasonable," he corrected with a tight smile. "But that's all in the past. Now we have a family connection to look forward to." I smiled back, allowing him to think he had successfully navigated dangerous waters. For the remainder of the lunch, I played along with their performance, the doting grandmother suddenly included, the happy couple graciously welcoming me into their plans, the excited discussion of wedding details that had been ongoing for months, without my input. After the lunch with Lynette and Tobias, I drove directly to Rosewood Estate. I needed to clear my head, to think through my next steps away from the artificial politeness of that restaurant. The estate had always been a sanctuary for me, the one property in my portfolio that I had purchased not just as an investment, but as a labor of love. Claudine met me at the entrance, her expression concerned. "How did it go, Mrs. Barrett?" "About as expected," I replied, managing a small smile. "They'd like a family discount, extended hours, and special access to the West Wing. Oh, and I'm suddenly invited to the wedding?" "How generous of them," Claudine said dryly. She had been with me for over 15 years, starting as a property manager for my commercial buildings before taking over Rosewood when I purchased it. She knew me well enough to read between the lines. "There's a couple touring the grounds right now," she added. "The Montgomerys. They're hoping to book for their daughter's wedding next spring." "I'll avoid the formal gardens then," I said, heading toward my private office in what had once been the estate's library. As I settled behind the antique mahogany desk, one of my few indulgences during the restoration, the full weight of the situation settled on my shoulders. Lynette's deception hurt deeply, but now I had to decide how to respond. I could simply refuse to host the wedding, but that felt petty. I could agree to their requests, allowing them to use the venue while maintaining the fiction that they had graciously included me after the misunderstanding. Or I could find another path, one that would reveal the truth without destroying relationships permanently. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Mrs. Barrett, there's someone here to see you." "A Mr. Lawson?" I stiffened. Gerard Lawson, Victoria's ex-husband and Lynette's father, was the last person I expected to encounter today. "Send him in," I said after a moment's hesitation. Gerard entered looking much as he had when I last saw him nearly 20 years ago, though his once dark hair was now silver at the temples. He still carried himself with the confident air of the banker's son, though time had softened the arrogance I remembered. "Honora," he said, offering his hand. "It's been a long time." "It has," I agreed, shaking his hand briefly. "What brings you to Rosewood Estate?" "Lynette called me," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk without being invited. She was quite upset. "About being caught in a lie, or about discovering her grandmother owns the venue she's desperate to book?" I asked, more sharply than I intended. Gerard had the grace to wince. "Both, I imagine, though she framed it rather differently." "I'm sure she did." He studied me for a moment before leaning forward. "Honora, I didn't come here to defend Lynette's actions. What she did was wrong, but I did come to offer some context that might help you understand." I raised an eyebrow, waiting. "When Victoria and I divorced, you stepped in completely. You provided financially, Emotionally, you became the stable force in Lynette's life while Victoria and I were falling apart. You taught her practical skills, values, a work ethic I frankly wish I had instilled. But, I prompted, sensing where this was heading. But I also failed her in important ways, Gerard admitted. After the divorce, I was inconsistent. When I did see her, I compensated for my absence with extravagance, expensive gifts, fancy restaurants, trips abroad when I could afford them. I wanted her to have the lifestyle I grew up with, the one I thought I'd always provide. You spoiled her, I translated. I created an impossible standard, he corrected. I showed her glimpses of a world of privilege, then disappeared back into my own problems, leaving her to reconcile those experiences with the more modest life she led with Victoria and with you. I considered his words, recognizing the truth in them. While I had taught Lynette practicality and the value of hard work, Gerard had introduced her to a world of privilege and status. No wonder she had been so easily drawn into Tobias's orbit, so ready to reinvent herself as someone who belonged in that world. That doesn't excuse cutting me out of her wedding, I said finally. No, it doesn't, he agreed. Nothing excuses that, but it might help explain her susceptibility to the Harringtons' influence. You know them? I asked, surprised. Gerard's expression hardened slightly. I know Senator Harrington from banking circles. His family's finances have been precarious for years, though they maintain appearances admirably. I suspect they see Lynette as a fresh injection of capital through Tobias. Except Lynette doesn't have capital, I pointed out. Not yet, anyway. But they believe she will, through you. Victoria may have mentioned your success in real estate, and they've drawn their own conclusions. He hesitated. There's something else you should know. Tobias has been through 2 broken engagements in the past 3 years, both times to women from wealthy families. This was new information, something Jamie hadn't uncovered. You think he's pursuing Lynette for financial reasons? I think the Harringtons have expectations about who their son marries, and those expectations involve financial stability the family increasingly lacks. We sat in silence for a moment, the implications settling between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been nagging at me since his arrival. Why are you telling me this, Gerard? After 20 years of minimal contact with Lynette, why involve yourself now? He looked down, seemingly gathering his thoughts before meeting my gaze again. Because I failed her once, and I don't want to fail her again. Because despite our differences, I know you've always wanted what's best for her. And because I received an invitation to a wedding that conspicuously excluded the woman who did more for my daughter than I ever did. His honesty surprised me. The Gerard I remembered had been too proud to acknowledge others' contributions, too focused on appearances to admit his own shortcomings. I'm not asking you to forgive Lynette's behavior, he continued, but I am asking you to help me make sure she doesn't make a mistake she'll regret for the rest of her life. If she's marrying Tobias for the right reasons, fine. But if she's being manipulated or manipulating herself into a marriage based on false pretenses and social climbing, she deserves better. What exactly are you proposing? I asked, intrigued despite my lingering hurt. An alliance of sorts. You control the venue they desperately want. I'm the father who's expected to pay for a wedding that's already over budget. Together, we might have enough leverage to at least slow things down, to create space for Lynette, to reconsider her choices, all of her choices. I studied him, looking for signs of the entitled, dismissive man who had once treated me as irrelevant. Instead, I saw genuine concern, regret, and a humility that years and perhaps failures had taught him. I have a meeting with Tobias's parents tomorrow, I said finally. They've suddenly decided they want to meet the grandmother Lynette never mentioned. Gerard smiled slightly. Of course they do, now that they know you own Rosewood Estate. Exactly. I think it's time the Harringtons and Lynette understand exactly who they've been dismissing. I paused, considering the possibilities this unexpected alliance offered. "Are you free tomorrow afternoon, Gerard? I think the senator and his wife might benefit from meeting both of Lynette's supposedly estranged parents at once." His smile widened to a grin that reminded me, oddly, of Lynette as a child. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Honora. Just tell me when and where." As Gerard left, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The hurt remained, but now it was channeled towards something constructive, not revenge but revelation. It was time for the facades to fall, for truth to emerge, however uncomfortable it might be. I picked up my phone and called Claudine. "I need you to arrange something special for tomorrow's meeting with the Harringtons. And please call Philip. See? If he and Jamie can fly in by the weekend, this wedding situation is about to get interesting." That evening, I sat in my apartment above the hardware store, surrounded by photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Pictures of Victoria as a child helping Augustine measure lumber. Philip's first summer working construction. Lynette in her tiny, hard hat, proudly holding a paintbrush next to a wall we had painted together. What had happened to that curious, enthusiastic child who had once been so proud to learn from me? When had my values and knowledge transformed from precious wisdom to embarrassing reminders of a background she wanted to escape? My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Mother, Lynette told me about lunch. I'm so glad you've worked things out. The wedding will be perfect at Rosewood." I set the phone down without replying. Victoria's willingness to overlook her daughter's deception and her own complicity in it, for the sake of securing the venue, was telling. Like Lynette, she saw my discovery as a fortunate turn of events rather than a painful revelation of their true feelings. As midnight approached, I made my decision. Not in anger or revenge, but with the clarity that comes from recognizing a fundamental truth. I had allowed myself to be taken for granted for far too long. I had worked in the shadows, providing financial security and practical support while asking little in return. I had accepted being marginalized, being treated as the embarrassing relation whose contributions were welcome, but whose presence was not. No more. I spent the next few hours at my desk, working methodically through files and making notes. By dawn, I had a clear plan, not to punish Lynette or humiliate the Harringtons, but to ensure that whatever happened next would be based on truth rather than illusion. My first call was to my attorney, Harold, who had managed my legal affairs for decades. "I need some documents drawn up immediately," I told him, explaining my requirements in detail. "Are you sure about this, Honora?" he asked when I had finished. "It's quite a significant restructuring." "I've never been more certain," I replied. "How quickly can you have the papers ready?" "For you, by this afternoon. But I want to register my professional concern. These changes are substantial." "Noted," I said, "but they're necessary, and long overdue." Next, I called Claudine to finalize arrangements for the afternoon meeting with the Harringtons at Rosewood. I wanted everything perfect, not to impress them, but to establish the context for what would follow. "The West Parlor, I think," I told her. "And please have refreshments ready. The good china and silver, fresh flowers from the cutting garden." "Of course, Mrs. Barrett. And will Mr. Lawson be joining you as planned?" "Yes, along with my son Philip and his husband Jamie. They're flying in this morning." I had called Philip after my conversation with Gerard, explaining not just the situation with Lynette, but my decision about how to address it. To my relief, he had immediately offered to come, understanding intuitively what was at stake. By mid-morning, a courier arrived with the documents from Harold. I reviewed them carefully, signed where indicated, and arranged for them to be returned to his office for final processing. What I was doing couldn't be undone easily, but I was certain it was right, not just for me, but ultimately for Lynette as well. Victoria called twice while I was preparing for the meeting. I let both calls go to voicemail, not ready yet to face. her explanations or excuses. Whatever Victoria thought she understood about the situation, she was missing the central point. This wasn't about a wedding venue or an invitation. It was about respect, honesty, and the values I had tried to instill in my family. I dressed with particular care, choosing a tailored navy dress that conveyed authority without ostentation. I added my mother's pearls, the one heirloom she had been able to leave me, and a simple gold bracelet Augustine had given me for our 30th anniversary. These tokens of my past seemed especially important today as I prepared to shape my future, and perhaps Lynette's as well. As I drove to Rosewood, I found myself unusually calm. The hurt remained, of course. That wouldn't disappear overnight. But it had been channeled into resolve, into a determination to address the underlying issues rather than merely the symptoms. Philip and Jamie were waiting in the driveway when I arrived, having come directly from the airport. Philip embraced me warmly, his tall frame still reminiscent of Augustine's despite the silver threading through his dark hair. "Mom, you look formidable," he said with a smile. "The Harringtons won't know what hit them." "This isn't about hitting anyone," I reminded him. "It's about clarity." "And truth," Jamie added, kissing my cheek, "which some people find more devastating than any blow." Gerard arrived minutes later, looking uncharacteristically nervous in a well-cut suit. "Honora," he greeted me, then turned to Philip with visible surprise. "Philip, it's been years." 22? Give or take, Philip replied coolly. He had never forgiven Gerard for the pain the divorce had caused Victoria, regardless of the complexities involved. "Shall we focus on the present situation?" I suggested, guiding them toward the house. "The Harringtons will be here in 30 minutes, followed by Lynette and Tobias." Inside, Claudine had arranged everything perfectly. The west parlor, with its views of the formal gardens, had been my favorite room during the restoration. I had personally selected the antique Persian carpet, restored the original crown molding, and chosen the artwork, understated landscapes by local artists rather than showy pieces designed to impress. "Philip, did you bring the documents I asked for?" I inquired as we settled in. He nodded, opening his briefcase to extract a folder. "Everything's here. The property records for Rosewood, the original purchase agreement, the current market valuation, and the portfolio summary you requested." I reviewed the materials quickly, satisfied that they provided the factual foundation I needed. Then I outlined my plan to the three men, explaining exactly what I intended to do and why. Gerard whistled low. "That's definitive." "It's fair," I corrected. "And necessary." "Lynette won't see it that way," he warned. "At least not initially." "I'm not concerned with her initial reaction," I replied. "I'm concerned with her long-term welfare, and with the truth." Philip studied me with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mom, are you absolutely sure about this? Once you set this in motion?" "I'm sure," I interrupted gently. "I've had 40 years to build something meaningful. It's time to be clear about what that meaning is and who shares in it." Jamie checked his watch. "They'll be here any minute. Last chance to reconsider." I shook my head, gathering the documents into a neat stack and placing them on the side table. "No reconsideration?" "Necessary. For the first time in years, I know exactly what I'm doing and why." As if on cue, Claudine appeared at the door. "Mrs. Barrett, the Harringtons have arrived." I stood, smoothing my dress and squaring my shoulders. Today would change everything: my relationship with Lynette, her understanding of her past and future, perhaps even her choice of husband. It was not a decision I had made lightly, but it was one I was prepared to stand behind. "Show them in," I said. It's time they met the real Honora Barrett. Senator Maxwell Harrington and his wife Elaine swept into the parlor with the practiced confidence of people accustomed to commanding attention. He was tall and distinguished with perfectly coiffed silver hair and the kind of tan that suggested regular golf outings. She was slender and elegant in an expensive St. John suit, not unlike ones in my own rarely worn collection. Her blonde hair arranged in a sophisticated updo that probably required an hour at an exclusive salon. "Mrs. Barrett," the senator said, extending his hand with a politician's smile. "What a pleasure to finally meet you. Tobias has told us so much about Lynette's family." I doubted that very much, considering Lynette had been systematically minimizing my existence, but I simply smiled and shook his hand. "Senator Harrington, Mrs. Harrington, welcome to Rosewood Estate." Elaine Harrington's eyes darted around the room, taking in the elegant furnishings, the original artwork, and, most notably, the presence of 3 men she hadn't expected to see. "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked a few family members to join us," I explained, gesturing to where Philip, Jamie, and Gerard stood. "My son Philip and his husband Jamie are visiting from Seattle, and of course you know that Gerard is Lynette's father." A flicker of surprise crossed Elaine's face. "Of course. How lovely to have everyone together." I made the introductions, watching as the senator shifted smoothly into networking mode, asking Philip about his architectural firm and engaging Gerard with questions about the banking industry. Elaine, meanwhile, settled onto the sofa with the practiced grace of someone who had attended countless society events. "Mrs. Barrett, I must say, Rosewood is even more beautiful than I imagined," she said, accepting a cup of tea from Claudine. "You've done a remarkable job with the restoration. Did you work with Westfield Interiors? They did our summer house in the Hamptons." "No, I managed the restoration myself," I replied. "I have quite a bit of experience with historic properties." Her eyebrows rose slightly. "How fascinating. Tobias mentioned you were in real estate, but I had no idea you were so hands-on." Before I could respond, the door opened again, and Lynette and Tobias entered. My granddaughter froze momentarily at the sight of her father and brother in the room, clearly not expecting their presence. Tobias, ever the diplomat, recovered more quickly. "Dad, Mom, you've met Mrs. Barrett," he said, moving forward to kiss his mother's cheek. "And Mr. Lawson, good to see you again. Philip, Jamie, what a nice surprise." Lynette remained near the door, her expression a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "Dad? Philip, what are you doing here?" "Supporting you, of course," Gerard replied smoothly. "When I heard about the wonderful news regarding the wedding venue, I reached out to your grandmother, and since Philip and Jamie were planning to fly in for the wedding anyway, they decided to come early. This was a fabrication we had agreed upon. No need to reveal that I had orchestrated this gathering, at least not yet." Lynette's eyes found mine, filled with questions and a hint of suspicion. I simply smiled and gestured for her to join us. "Come in, dear. We were just getting acquainted." As she crossed the room to sit beside Tobias on the love seat opposite his parents, I noticed how she mimicked Elaine's posture, how she had styled her hair in a similar updo. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. My granddaughter was methodically recreating herself in the image of her future mother-in-law. "Now, Mrs. Barrett," Senator Harrington began once everyone was settled, "Tobias tells us you might be able to accommodate their wedding here at Rosewood, despite your usual booking policies. We're prepared to be quite generous to ensure Lynette has the perfect day." "Please, call me Honora," I replied. "And yes, I'm certainly considering making an exception for my only granddaughter's wedding." "Wonderful," Elaine exclaimed. "We've already spoken with Andre about the flowers. He did the governor's daughter's wedding last year, and Tobias's godfather has offered his catering service at cost. Of course, we'll need to expand the guest list somewhat. The original venue could only accommodate 200, but I understand Rosewood can handle up to 250 with the right arrangement." I glanced at Lynette, who was staring at her hands in her lap. Clearly, she had not been consulted about these expansions to her wedding plans. "Actually," I said, "Rosewood's capacity is 180 when using both the ballroom and terrace. Any more than that would violate our safety protocols and insurance requirements. Oh, but surely for family, Elaine began. Mother, Tobias interjected with a warning glance. I'm sure we can work within those constraints. Senator Harrington leaned forward, his expression shifting to one I recognized from negotiating with seasoned businessmen. Honora, we understand. You've built quite an impressive portfolio of properties over the years. Lynette mentioned you own several commercial buildings downtown, in addition to Rosewood. She did? I asked, genuinely surprised. Given Lynette's efforts to minimize my accomplishments, this seemed out of character. Well, not in so many words, he admitted. But Tobias and I did a bit of research after discovering your ownership of Rosewood. Barrett Properties owns quite a significant percentage of commercial real estate in the area, doesn't it? And there it was, the real reason for their sudden interest in meeting me. Not to welcome the grandmother of their future daughter-in-law, but to assess the financial possibilities I represented. Yes, I've been fortunate in my investments, I replied non-committally. Modest as well as successful, Elaine commented with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You know, Maxwell and I were just discussing how refreshing it is to meet someone who's achieved so much while maintaining such discretion about their wealth. Philip caught my eye, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. He had always been perceptive about people's motivations, and the Harringtons' interest in my financial status was hardly subtle. Speaking of discretion, I said, reaching for the folder Philip had brought, I thought it might be helpful for everyone to have a clear understanding of certain arrangements before we proceed with wedding plans. Lynette straightened, her expression wary. Grandma, what arrangements? I opened the folder and extracted several documents, placing them neatly on the coffee table. These are the property records for Rosewood Estate, including the purchase agreement from 5 years ago when I acquired it through Barrett Holdings, LLC. Is that really necessary right now? Tobias asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. I believe it is, I replied calmly. You see, when I purchased Rosewood, I had a specific vision for its future, not just as a wedding venue or event space, but as part of a legacy for my family. Senator Harrington's expression sharpened with interest. A legacy? Do elaborate. I'd be happy to, I said, meeting Lynette's increasingly anxious gaze. But first, I think it's important that we all acknowledge why we're really here today. To discuss the wedding venue, of course, Elaine said quickly. No, I corrected gently. We're here because Lynette excluded me from her wedding plans until she discovered I owned the venue she wanted. We're here because the Harringtons suddenly found me worth meeting once they realized my financial position. And we're here because it's time for the truth to be acknowledged before any further plans are made. A heavy silence fell over the room. Lynette's face had drained of color, while Tobias shifted uncomfortably beside her. The senator's expression remained carefully neutral, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. Only Elaine seemed genuinely flustered, her perfectly manicured hand fluttering to her pearl necklace. Now, I continued, lifting another document from the folder, I believe we should discuss exactly what Rosewood Estate means for Lynette's future and for all of our next steps. Grandma, Lynette interjected, her voice tight with anxiety. This isn't necessary right now. We're just here to discuss the wedding arrangements. On the contrary, I replied, my voice gentle but firm. It's entirely necessary. Before we discuss any wedding arrangements, we need clarity about where we all stand. I turned to the Harringtons, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the tension filling the room. Senator, Mrs. Harrington, I understand you've done some research on my business holdings. What exactly are you hoping to learn? The senator recovered quickly, his political instincts kicking in. Merely background, Honora. Getting to know family is important to us. Is that why you waited until now to express any interest in meeting me? Despite the fact that your son has been dating my granddaughter for nearly 2 years? Elaine's smile tightened. We've been terribly busy with Maxwell's Senate duties and our charitable commitments. I'm sure you understand. I understand perfectly, I said. Just as I understand why Lynette told people I was a retired receptionist living quietly, rather than acknowledging my actual accomplishments. Why she told Philip I had mobility issues that prevented me from attending her wedding. Why my invitation was conveniently lost until you discovered I owned this estate. Lynette flushed crimson. That's not what happened. It's exactly what happened, Gerard interrupted, his voice surprisingly gentle despite the firmness of his words. Let's not compound the situation with more deception, Lynette. Tobias placed a protective arm around Lynette's shoulders. Mrs. Barrett, with all due respect, these are family matters that could be discussed privately. My parents came here today in good faith. They came to assess my wealth and determine whether I might be useful to them, I corrected. Just as you suddenly found me worth including in your wedding plans once you realized I controlled something. You wanted, the senator leaned forward, abandoning pretense. Honora, we seem to have gotten off on the wrong foot. We genuinely want to welcome you into our family circle. Lynette is a delightful young woman, and obviously her upbringing reflects well on you. Yet not well enough to acknowledge me until now, I observed. Philip, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. Senator Harrington, my mother isn't interested in being patronized or in having her very legitimate concerns sidestepped. If we're going to move forward productively, let's dispense with the political double talk. Jamie nodded in agreement. We're all here because Lynette deliberately excluded her grandmother from her wedding, then suddenly changed course when she discovered who owned Rosewood Estate. Those are the facts. The question is where we go from here. Elaine Harrington's composure faltered. This is also unnecessary. We're simply trying to arrange a beautiful wedding for the young couple. If there have been misunderstandings— This wasn't a misunderstanding, I said quietly, looking directly at Lynette. It was a deliberate choice to erase me from your narrative because you were ashamed of who I am. Or perhaps more accurately, of who you thought I was. Tears welled in Lynette's eyes. I wasn't ashamed. Tobias's family is so established, so prominent. I wanted to fit in. By pretending your background was different than it is? By hiding the grandmother who helped raise you because I don't fit your image of what a successful person looks like? Tobias straightened, his jaw tightening. Mrs. Barrett, Lynette has been under considerable pressure. My family does have certain social expectations. She was simply trying to navigate a complex situation. At my expense, I noted, and at the expense of her own integrity. The senator, sensing the conversation spinning beyond his control, attempted to redirect. Perhaps we should focus on the present. Honora, you clearly care about Lynette, and we all want what's best for her. Surely we can find common ground in ensuring she has the wedding she deserves at this beautiful estate you've created. I turned my attention to him, noting the calculating look in his eyes despite his conciliatory words. Yes, let's talk about Rosewood. Senator, I understand your family considered purchasing this property years ago? He nodded, seemingly relieved by the change of subject. We did. It would have made an excellent addition to our hospitality portfolio, but the timing wasn't right. The timing wasn't right, I repeated. Or perhaps the price wasn't right. According to my sources, the Harrington hotel chain has been struggling for some time. Declining occupancy, outdated properties requiring significant renovation, increasing competition from boutique accommodations and short-term rentals. The sudden stillness of both Harringtons confirmed Jamie's intelligence had been accurate. Tobias shifted uncomfortably, while Lynette looked between her fiancé and me with growing confusion. Business has its natural cycles, the senator said, dismissively, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed his discomfort. The Harrington name remains synonymous with luxury accommodations. And with significant debt, I added. Which makes me wonder about your sudden interest in my financial holdings and in ensuring your son marries my granddaughter now that you know about my success. Elaine's face flushed with indignation. Are you implying, I'm stating plainly, I interrupted, that your family's interest in mine seems to have materialized precisely when you discovered I had significant assets? Just as Lynette's desire to include me in her wedding coincided exactly with learning I owned Rosewood. Lynette stood abruptly. This isn't fair. You're twisting everything. I looked at my granddaughter, really looked at her, seeing both the poised young woman she had become, and the little girl who had once followed me around construction sites. Despite my hurt, my love for her remained unwavering, which is why I couldn't let this deception continue. Lynette, I said gently, when you were 12 years old, you helped me renovate the old McAllister building downtown. Do you remember what you said when we finished? She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I said I wanted to build beautiful places like you did. And I told you that the most beautiful things we build aren't made of brick and wood, but of honesty and integrity. That without a solid foundation of truth, even the most impressive structure will eventually collapse. Tears spilled down her cheeks now. Grandma, please. You've been constructing a false image, Lynette, pretending to be someone you're not to impress people whose approval you think you need. But that kind of construction is fundamentally unstable. Tobias stood beside her, his arms still protectively around her shoulders. Mrs. Barrett, I think Lynette understands your point. There's no need to belabor it. I turned my attention to him. And you, Tobias. 2 broken engagements in 3 years, both to young women from wealthy families. Both ended when financial expectations weren't met. His face paled. Who told you? Does Lynette know about Charlotte Morrison and Rebecca Thornton? I asked. About how quickly your interest cooled when their family fortunes proved less accessible than anticipated. That's enough, Senator Harrington said sharply, standing to his full height. We came here in good faith, not to have our family dragged through the mud. You came here to evaluate my wealth and determine whether I might solve your financial problems through my granddaughter, I corrected. Just as Lynette came hoping to secure a discount on a venue she couldn't otherwise afford for a wedding designed to impress people she's been systematically deceiving. The room fell silent, the truth of my words hanging in the air like smoke. Lynette's tears flowed freely now, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of reality. Tobias looked less concerned with her distress than with his own exposure, while his parents exchanged glances that spoke volumes about calculations being rapidly revised. So, I continued into the silence, now that we've established where we truly stand, we can discuss what happens next. The tension in the room was palpable as I reached for the final set of documents in my folder. These papers represented not just legal arrangements, but the culmination of decades of work, careful planning, and values I had tried to instill in my family. 40 years ago, I began, my voice steady, I purchased my first property with money I had saved from my receptionist job. It was a small, dilapidated cottage that everyone, including my husband, thought was a terrible investment. I renovated it myself, sold it for twice what I paid, and used the profits to buy 2 more properties. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each person in turn. That was the beginning of Barrett Properties. Today, our portfolio includes 27 commercial buildings, 42 residential properties, and 4 special venues, including Rosewood Estate. The combined value exceeds $40 million. Elaine Harrington couldn't quite suppress her gasp. The senator leaned forward with renewed interest, while Tobias stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Lynette simply looked stunned, as if trying to reconcile this information with the grandmother she thought she knew. I never flaunted my success, I continued. I lived modestly, reinvested profits, and focused on building something that would last. I believed in creating genuine value rather than the appearance of wealth. I extracted the key document from the folder, and placed it on the coffee table. This is a trust agreement drawn up by my attorney this morning. It restructures the ownership of Barrett properties, including Rosewood Estate, effective immediately. The senator reached for the document, but I gently placed my hand over it. Before you review this, I want everyone to understand why I'm doing this. This isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about legacy and values. I turned to Lynette, whose tears had subsided, replaced by a wary curiosity. When you were growing up, I tried to teach you the value of honest work, of substance over appearance, of building something meaningful rather than simply acquiring status symbols. Somewhere along the way, you lost sight of those lessons. Grandma, she began, but I raised my hand slightly. Please let me finish, then you'll have your chance to speak. I took a deep breath and continued. I created Barrett Properties to ensure financial security for my family, yes. But more importantly, to pass on the values that guided its creation: integrity, diligence, responsibility, and gratitude. I slid the document toward the center of the table. This trust divides Barrett Properties into 3 segments. 30% will remain under my management during my lifetime, then transfer to a charitable foundation supporting women in construction and real estate development. The senator's brow furrowed at this, clearly disappointed that a significant portion would be directed away from family, and by extension, from any potential benefit to the Harringtons. Another 30%, I continued, is allocated to Philip and Jamie, to be managed according to the principles that built the company in the first place. Philip nodded solemnly, aware of this provision from our earlier conversation. And the remaining 40%? The senator asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious calculation happening behind his eyes. I turned to Lynette. That portion is designated for you, Lynette. Her eyes widened. Me? But, however, I continued, it comes with conditions. Tobias stiffened beside her, his interest unmistakable. What kind of conditions? I ignored him, keeping my focus on my granddaughter. The trust stipulates that before taking control of your portion, you must complete a 3-year apprenticeship with Barrett Properties, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up: property evaluation, renovation, management, tenant relations, financial planning, and corporate governance. The color drained from Lynette's face as she realized the implications. 3 years? During which time, I continued calmly, the assets remain in trust, with income reinvested rather than distributed. You would receive a fair salary for your work, but not access to the underlying assets or their full income potential. Senator Harrington's expression darkened. That's quite an onerous requirement for a young woman about to start married life. It's an opportunity to earn what she will inherit, I corrected. To understand its value by understanding how it was created. Elaine turned to Lynette, her dismay evident. Darling, 3 years is a very long time to defer your future plans. The implication was clear. 3 years was too long for the Harringtons to wait for access to the Barrett fortune. Tobias cleared his throat. Mrs. Barrett, while I appreciate your desire to ensure Lynette understands the business, surely there's a more expedient arrangement possible. Perhaps a shorter apprenticeship or some form of concurrent distribution. The terms are non-negotiable, I replied simply. And there's one more provision you should be aware of. I turned the page to reveal the final stipulation. The apprenticeship must be undertaken as a single woman. If Lynette marries before completing the 3-year term, her portion reverts to the charitable foundation. A stunned silence fell over the room. Even Philip and Gerard, who had known the broad outlines of my plan, seemed surprised by this final condition. That's outrageous, Senator Harrington sputtered, abandoning all pretense of diplomacy. You're essentially forcing her to choose between her fiancé and her inheritance. I'm asking her to pause and reflect before making a lifetime commitment, I corrected. to ensure that commitment is based on love and shared values rather than financial considerations or social climbing. Lynette stared at me, a complex mixture of emotions playing across her face: shock, hurt, anger, and perhaps a glimmer of something else. Understanding? Relief? "You don't think I love Tobias," she said softly. "I think you love the life you believe he represents," I replied with equal gentleness. "The status, the connections, the social position. I think you've been so focused on becoming someone the Harringtons would accept that you've lost sight of who you actually are." Tobias stood abruptly. "This is manipulative and controlling. You're using your money to dictate Lynette's personal choices." "No," I said firmly. "I'm ensuring the wealth I've created supports the values that created it. Lynette is free to choose whatever path she wishes. She can marry you tomorrow if that's what she truly wants. But she should make that choice with full awareness of what she's choosing and what she's giving up." The senator had been scanning the trust document as we spoke, his expression growing increasingly grim. "These terms are extraordinarily restrictive. I assume they're legally binding?" "Completely," I confirmed. "My attorney filed the paperwork this morning. The trust is already established and funded." Elaine turned to her husband. They're silent. "Exchange speaking volumes?" Then she rose with practiced grace, smoothing her skirt. "I think perhaps we should give Lynette and her grandmother some privacy to discuss these arrangements. Family matters, after all." The transparent attempt to remove Lynette from my influence might have been amusing under different circumstances. But I simply nodded, understanding that the Harringtons needed to regroup and reassess, now that their plans for easy access to the Barrett fortune had been thoroughly derailed. "Of course," I said. "Claudine can show you to the terrace while we talk. The gardens are particularly beautiful this time of year." As the Harringtons reluctantly followed Claudine from the room, Tobias hesitated, looking back at Lynette. "Don't let her manipulate you," he said, his voice low but audible to everyone present. "We'll figure this out." The door closed behind them, leaving Lynette facing me, Philip, Jamie, and her father. Her expression was a storm of conflicting emotions, tears threatening again. "How could you do this?" she whispered. "In front of everyone? It's humiliating." "The truth can be uncomfortable," I acknowledged, "but continuing the deception would have been far more damaging in the long run." Gerard moved to sit beside his daughter. "Lynette, your grandmother isn't doing this to hurt you. She's trying to protect you from making decisions you might regret forever." "By forcing me to choose between Tobias and money?" she asked bitterly. "By asking you to consider what truly matters to you," Philip corrected gently, "and whom you can trust to value you for yourself, not for what you provide access to." Lynette looked around at us, her family, who had assembled not to condemn her, but to help her see what she had been blind to. Her shoulders slumped slightly as the defensive anger began to give way to something more reflective. "The wedding at Rosewood," she said finally. "Was that ever actually possible?" I smiled softly at my granddaughter. "Rosewood has always been yours, Lynette. From the moment you pointed it out to me as a child and said it would make a beautiful wedding venue, I bought it with you in mind." Lynette's expression shifted from shock to confusion, then to a reluctant softening as my words sank in. "You bought Rosewood? For me?" "I did," I confirmed. "After you pointed it out all those years ago, I began looking into it. When it finally became available, I saw it as a legacy project, something beautiful we could eventually share." "But you never told me," she said, a hint of accusation in her voice. "I was waiting for the right time," I admitted. "And then you began to pull away. Your calls became less frequent, your visits shorter and more perfunctory. When you did visit, you seemed embarrassed by my apartment, by my work clothes, by the very things we used to share." Lynette looked down at her hands, unable to deny the truth of my observation. "The more distance you created," I continued, the more I wondered if you'd even want to know about Rosewood, if you'd even want to be associated with something I had built. Philip leaned forward, his expression compassionate but firm. Lynette, do you remember when we were kids and Mom would take us to her properties on weekends? How excited you used to get about helping her? Lynette nodded reluctantly. Of course I remember. What changed? He asked simply. When did you start seeing her success as something to be ashamed of rather than proud of? Gerard, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. I think I can answer that. It was my fault, at least partially. We all turned to him, surprised by this admission. After Victoria and I divorced, I was inconsistent in Lynette's life. When I did see her, I tried to compensate by showing her the lifestyle I thought she deserved. Expensive restaurants, high-end shopping, country club events. I wanted her to feel comfortable in the world I came from, the world she might have grown up in if things had been different. He looked directly at his daughter, regret evident in his expression. But I never taught you the value of what your grandmother was building. I never helped you see that her way of life, practical, focused on substance rather than appearances, was actually the more admirable path. Lynette's eyes filled with tears again. I just wanted to fit in. When I met Tobias and his family, they were so polished. They talked about summer houses and charity galas and political connections. I felt like I had to become someone else to belong in their world. Even if it meant rejecting the people who truly loved you, I asked gently. She flinched as if I'd slapped her. I didn't reject you. You excluded me from your wedding. I reminded her. You told people I was a retired receptionist with mobility issues. You created a narrative that erased everything I am, everything we've shared. Jamie, who had been observing quietly, spoke up. Lynette, in my work as an investigator, I've seen people reinvent themselves countless times. Sometimes it's necessary for growth, for moving beyond difficult circumstances. But when reinvention requires denying fundamental truths and betraying people who love you, it's not growth, it's self-destruction. A heavy silence fell over the room as Lynette absorbed these words. Through the French doors, we could see the Harringtons on the terrace, engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion. Senator Harrington was gesturing emphatically while Elaine repeatedly shook her head. Tobias stood slightly apart, his expression unreadable from this distance. Finally, Lynette spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What am I supposed to do now? Call off the wedding? Tell Tobias I need 3 years to learn the real estate business before we can get married? You're supposed to be honest, I said simply. With Tobias? With his family? With yourself? If your relationship is based on genuine love and shared values, a delay won't destroy it. If it's based primarily on social advancement and financial calculations, I let the implication hang unspoken. And what about the wedding? She asked. Everyone's already been invited. Deposits have been paid. It would be so humiliating to cancel. Gerard placed a hand on her shoulder. More humiliating than marrying someone who might be more interested in your grandmother's money than in you? Lynette's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Tobias isn't like that. He loves me. Then, he'll wait, Philip said gently. He'll support your decision to learn about your inheritance before you share it. He'll want you to understand its value and responsibility. And if he doesn't? Lynette's voice trembled slightly. Then you'll have learned something invaluable. Before making a lifetime commitment, I answered. The door opened, and Tobias re-entered alone, his expression carefully composed. Lynette, my parents are ready to leave. They think it would be best if we all took some time to process this new information. I studied his face, looking for signs of his true reaction to the trust arrangement. His politician's sun mask was firmly in place, But the tightness around his eyes and the slight clench of his jaw suggested barely contained anger or frustration. "Tobias," Lynette began uncertainly. "We need to talk about—" "Not here," he interrupted, glancing pointedly at the rest of us. "We should discuss this privately." I recognized the tactic immediately. Isolate Lynette from her family's influence. Work on her alone where she might be more susceptible to emotional manipulation. "Actually," I said, rising from my chair, "I think Lynette could use some time with her family right now. Perhaps you and your parents could return to your hotel, and Lynette can call you later when she's had a chance to consider her options." Tobias's mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of anger before he recovered. "Of course, Mrs. Barrett. Whatever you think is best for your granddaughter." The sarcasm in his tone was subtle but unmistakable. He turned to Lynette, his expression softening in a way that seemed calculated rather than genuine. "Call me when you're ready to talk, darling. Remember, we're a team. We'll figure this out together." After he left, Lynette remained silent, staring out the window as the Harringtons' luxury sedan disappeared down the driveway. The tension in the room was palpable, each of us waiting for her reaction, unsure whether she would respond with anger, tears, or something else entirely. Finally, she turned to face us, her expression unexpectedly calm. "They never asked a single question about me." "What do you mean?" Gerard asked, puzzled by this non sequitur. "The Harringtons," Lynette clarified. "When they arrived and saw Rosewood, when they heard about your business success, when you explained the trust, not once did they ask how I felt about any of it. Not once did they express concern for my well-being rather than for the wedding plans or the financial arrangements." A dawning realization seemed to cross her face. "Even Tobias. He said we'd figure this out together. But he didn't ask what I wanted. He just assumed I'd follow his lead." I watched my granddaughter carefully, recognizing this moment for what it was. The first crack in the facade she had so carefully constructed. The first glimmer of recognition that perhaps the world she had been striving to enter was not what she had imagined. "What do you want, Lynette?" I asked softly. "Not what will please Tobias or impress his family. Not what you think you should want. What do you, in your heart, truly want?" She looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. "I don't know anymore," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been trying so hard to be what they want that I've lost track of who I am." Gerard moved to her side, placing an arm around her shoulders. "Then maybe that's where you start. Rediscovering who Lynette Barrett really is, beneath all the careful impressions and calculated appearances." "And how am I supposed to do that?" she asked, a hint of her old vulnerability showing through. Philip smiled gently at his niece. "Well, there happens to be a 3-year apprenticeship available that might help with exactly that problem." For the first time that day, Lynette's laugh, small but genuine, filled the room, breaking the tension like a ray of sunlight through storm clouds. "You all planned this, didn't you?" she asked, looking around at us. "This whole confrontation, the trust, everything." "We coordinated," I acknowledged, "because we love you. Because sometimes the people who truly care about you are willing to risk your anger to protect you from harm, even harm you can't yet recognize." Lynette's expression grew serious again. "I need to talk to Tobias. I owe him that much." "Yes, you do," I agreed. "But perhaps first, you need to decide what you're going to say." I didn't see Lynette for 2 days after the meeting at Rosewood. She had gone back to her apartment in town, asking for space to think. I honored her request, though it was difficult, not to reach out, not to try to guide her through what I knew would be a painful reckoning. On the 3rd morning, my phone rang just after dawn. "Grandma?" Lynette's voice sounded different, clearer, steadier than I had heard it in years. "Can you meet me at Rosewood this afternoon? There's something I need to do, and I'd like you to be there." When I arrived at the estate a few hours Later, I found Lynette sitting on a stone bench in the formal garden. She wore simple jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, a striking contrast to the carefully coordinated, polished appearance she had adopted since meeting the Harringtons. "You look like yourself," I said as I joined her on the bench. She smiled faintly. "I feel more like myself than I have in a long time." She gestured to the gardens around us. "I've been thinking about how much I used to love working on projects with you. Remember when I was 14 and you let me design the landscaping for that small office building downtown?" "The Barrett Medical Plaza," I nodded. "Your design won an award from the City Beautification Committee." "I'd forgotten about that," she admitted. "I've forgotten a lot of things I should have remembered." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching a pair of cardinals flit among the boxwood hedges. "Tobias is coming here at 3, she said finally. "I asked him to meet me here because I need to end things properly, in a place that represents who I really am, not who I was pretending to be." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Are you sure that's what you want?" "I'm sure," she replied, her voice steady. "I've spent the last 2 days really thinking about our relationship, about when it changed from something genuine to something performative. I realized it happened so gradually I didn't even notice. Each small compromise, each little adjustment to please him or his family, until I woke up one day as someone I didn't recognize." She turned to face me fully. "But the worst part wasn't changing for him. It was what I did to you, excluding you from my wedding, being ashamed of you instead of proud. I don't know if you can ever forgive me for that." "Oh, Lynette," I said softly. "I forgave you the moment you started to see the truth. That's what love does." Tears welled in her eyes, but she brushed them away. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, or the trust, or Rosewood, or any of it. It's not about deserving," I told her. "It's about belonging. You're my granddaughter. All of this was always meant for you. Not as a reward, but as a legacy. A foundation for you to build your own life upon." Before she could respond, we heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Tobias had arrived, precisely on time as always. "Would you like me to leave you alone for this?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, I'd like you to stay, if that's all right. I need to do this with witnesses, to make sure I don't waver, but also to show Tobias that I'm not hiding anymore, that I'm proud of who I am and where I come from." We watched as Tobias approached across the lawn, dressed impeccably as always, in a tailored suit despite the casual meeting. His expression was confident, even triumphant, as if he had already decided how this conversation would end. "Lynette, darling," he called as he drew near. "I've been so worried. You haven't answered my calls." "I needed time to think," she replied, remaining seated beside me. "About us, about the wedding, about what I really want." He glanced at me briefly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before his politician's sun mask slipped back into place. "Sweetheart, we don't need to discuss this in front of your grandmother. This is between us." "No," Lynette said firmly. "That's exactly the problem, Tobias. Nothing has really been between just us. It's always been about appearances, about what your parents expect, about the image we present. I've spent 2 years molding myself to fit your world, and in the process, I lost myself." His smile faltered slightly. "You're upset about the trust situation, I understand. But my father's attorneys think we can challenge it. The marriage restriction is probably unenforceable." Lynette shook her head slowly. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about the money or the trust conditions. It's about the fact that when my grandmother revealed her worth, your entire family's attitude toward her changed instantly. It's about the fact that you've never once asked what I want or how I feel. You just assumed I'd follow whatever plan you and your parents devised." Tobias's expression hardened. Is that what she's been telling you? Turning you against me? My grandmother, Lynette said with quiet dignity, has done nothing but show me the truth I was too blind to see. And the truth is, I don't want to marry you, Tobias. I don't want to live a life of carefully managed appearances and strategic social connections. I want something real. The mask slipped completely then, revealing a cold anger that confirmed everything we had suspected. Something real? Like what? Renovating old buildings and living above a hardware store? You think that's going to make you happy after experiencing what my family can offer? Yes, Lynette said simply. Because it already did once. Before I forgot what real happiness feels like. She slipped the diamond ring from her finger and held it out to him. I'm sorry, Tobias. The wedding is off. The weeks following Lynette's broken engagement brought a flurry of changes. There were difficult phone calls to make, deposits to cancel, explanations to provide to confused friends and disappointed relatives. Victoria was initially furious, convinced that I had manipulated Lynette into throwing away the social opportunity of a lifetime. But as the dust settled, something remarkable began to happen. Lynette started to rediscover herself. It began with small things. She moved out of her sleek downtown apartment with its carefully curated designer furniture and into the caretaker's cottage on the Rosewood grounds. The cottage was simple but charming, with wide plank floors and large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light. It needs work, she admitted when she showed it to me. The kitchen is outdated, and the bathroom plumbing is questionable, at best. But I can fix it myself, the way you taught me. Her enthusiasm as she described her renovation plans reminded me so much of the teenage Lynette, the one who had spent weekends happily helping me strip woodwork and patch plaster. That familiar spark in her eyes was worth more than all the real estate I owned. One crisp autumn morning, about a month after the broken engagement, I arrived at Rosewood to find Lynette on a ladder, painting the cottage's front porch ceiling. "Haint blue," she explained when she saw me looking up. "It's traditional in Southern architecture, supposed to ward off evil spirits. I figured I could use all the protection I can get." I laughed, relieved to see her sense of humor returning. "How are you doing, really?" I asked as she climbed down from the ladder. She considered the question, wiping a smudge of paint from her cheek. "Better than I expected. There are still hard days, moments when I miss the certainty of knowing exactly what came next in my life. But mostly, I feel lighter. Like I've put down a heavy load I didn't even realize I was carrying." We walked to the main house where Claudine had prepared tea. As we settled in the morning room, Lynette pulled out a sketchbook filled with drawings. "I've been thinking about the apprenticeship," she said, sliding the book across to me. "About what I might actually contribute to Barrett Properties." I flipped through the pages, impressed by what I saw. Lynette had sketched plans for renovating several of my older commercial properties, transforming them into mixed-use spaces with apartments above street-level retail, exactly the kind of development our changing downtown needed. "These are excellent," I told her sincerely. "You've always had a good eye for potential." "I was thinking," she said hesitantly, "that maybe we could start with one project. Something small, to see if my ideas are actually viable. I'd want to be involved in every step, the budget planning, the contractor selection, the actual renovation work. Just like old times," I smiled. "Except now I'd be doing it as a professional, not just as your helper." Her expression grew serious. "I know I have a lot to learn about the business side of things, but I want to earn my place in Barrett Properties, not just inherit it." Pride swelled in my chest, along with a deep sense of gratitude that this bright, capable young woman was my granddaughter, and that I hadn't lost her to a world of empty social climbing and superficial values. "We'll start next week," I decided. "There's a small building on Maple Street that would be perfect for your first project. It needs a complete overhaul, but the bones are good." Her face lit up with genuine excitement. Really? You're not just humoring me? Lynette, I've never just humored you, I assured her. Even when you were 10 years old redecorating dollhouses, I took your ideas seriously. Later that afternoon, we walked the Rosewood grounds together, discussing her vision for the estate's future. No longer just a wedding venue, she imagined it as a community space, hosting art exhibitions, educational workshops on historic preservation, and yes, still the occasional wedding. I received an interesting phone call yesterday, she mentioned as we reached the rose garden. From Rebecca Thornton. I raised an eyebrow, recognizing the name of one of Tobias's former fiancés. Oh? Lynette nodded. She heard about our broken engagement and wanted to, well, warn me, I suppose, but also to connect. She's started a foundation that helps young women develop financial literacy and independence. She thought I might be interested in getting involved. Are you? I think. So, Lynette said thoughtfully. Not right away. I want to focus on my apprenticeship first. But eventually, I'd like to use what I learned to help other women understand their financial power. To recognize that they don't need to attach themselves to wealth. They can create it themselves. As the sun began to set over Rosewood's manicured grounds, I watched my granddaughter, no longer the polished, artificial version who had tried so hard to fit into the Harringtons' world, but the authentic, capable young woman who had always been there beneath the surface. You know, she said as we turned back toward the house, I spent so much time being ashamed of where I came from, trying to reinvent myself as someone with the right background and connections, but now I realize I had it backward all along. How? So? I asked. She linked her arm through mine, a gesture of affection she hadn't offered in years. The life you built, the skills you taught me, the values you tried to instill, those were never things to hide or overcome. They were advantages, strengths, the very things that will help me build something meaningful with my life, just like you did. In that moment, with the golden light of sunset illuminating Rosewood around us, I knew that regardless of what happened with the apprenticeship or the trust or any of the formal arrangements I had created, the true legacy I had hoped to pass on was already secure. 3 years passed more quickly than any of us expected. Lynette's apprenticeship, which had begun as a condition of her inheritance, transformed into a genuine partnership between us. The small Maple Street project led to larger ones, each more ambitious than the last. She brought fresh ideas and contemporary design sensibilities to Barrett Properties, while I contributed decades of practical experience and business acumen. On the day she officially completed her apprenticeship, we stood together on the terrace at Rosewood, overlooking the estate that had become the centerpiece of our shared legacy. I never thought I'd say this, Lynette admitted, but I'm almost sad the 3 years are over. I've learned so much working alongside you every day. Who says it has to end? I asked, smiling at the capable, confident woman my granddaughter had become. The trust conditions have been met, but our partnership doesn't have to change. Lynette had indeed fulfilled every requirement I had established, learning the business from the ground up, participating in every aspect of property management and development, proving herself not just as my heir, but as a talented businesswoman in her own right. Tomorrow she would formally take control of her portion of Barrett Properties, no longer as an apprentice, but as a full partner. Have you thought about what you'll do first? I asked. Now that you have full decision-making authority over your share? She nodded, her expression thoughtful. I want to establish a mentorship program for young women interested in real estate development and construction. Something that provides both practical training and financial backing for their first projects. Like what I did for you, but on a larger scale, I observed. Exactly. Because not everyone is fortunate enough to have an Honora Barrett in their life. She squeezed my hand affectionately. Though now that I think about it, maybe we should call it the Barrett Women's Development Initiative, to make sure your name stays connected to it. We were interrupted by Philip calling from the house. "Are you two still talking business? The guests are arriving." The occasion that had brought family and friends to Rosewood that day wasn't just the completion of Lynette's apprenticeship. It was also, perhaps more significantly, her wedding day. Not to Tobias Harrington, who, we had heard, was now engaged to a senator's daughter with an actual trust fund, but to Jamie, a young contractor who had worked on several of our renovation projects. They had met when Lynette was supervising the Maple Street building, bonding over shared interests in historic preservation and sustainable building practices. Their relationship had developed slowly, based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than social calculations or financial considerations. When Jamie proposed after 18 months of dating, he did so not with an ostentatious diamond, but with a simple question: "Will you build a life with me?" The wedding was everything the Harrington affair would not have been: intimate, authentic, and joyful. Held in Rosewood's garden with only 60 guests, it featured locally sourced food, flowers from the estate's own gardens, and music from a quartet of conservatory students Lynette had befriended while working on renovating their practice space. Victoria, who had gradually come to understand and even appreciate the path Lynette had chosen, helped coordinate the celebration. Gerard gave his daughter away with genuine pride, having become more consistently present in her life over the past 3 years. Philip and his husband Jamie had flown in from Seattle with their newly adopted daughter, completing our family circle. As I watched Lynette and her Jamie exchange vows beneath an arbor she had restored herself, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought us to this moment. What had begun as a painful exclusion, a granddaughter too ashamed to invite me to her wedding, had transformed into something far more meaningful than I could have imagined. The true legacy I would leave behind wasn't Rosewood Estate or Barrett properties, though both would continue to provide for generations to come. It was the renewal of values I had always tried to embody: integrity, hard work, authenticity, and the courage to choose substance over appearances. Later, as the celebration continued under strings of garden lights, Lynette found me at a quiet corner table. "Happy?" I asked, already knowing the answer from the contentment that radiated from her. "More than I knew was possible," she confirmed, sitting beside me. "And grateful. If you hadn't done what you did, confronting me about the wedding, creating the trust, forcing me to see the truth, I'd be in a very different place now." "You would have found your way eventually," I assured her. "You were always too intelligent, too genuine at heart to live a lie forever." She shook her head. "I'm not so sure. Sometimes we need the people who love us most to show us hard truths we can't see for ourselves." In the soft evening light, with rosewood glowing around us and the sounds of genuine celebration filling the air, I knew that everything, the decades of work, the painful confrontations, the difficult choices, had been worthwhile. Not because of the wealth I had accumulated or the properties I had developed, but because of the woman sitting beside me, finally at home in her own skin and ready to build her own legacy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.